In the winter of 1883, travelers along the Arkansas backroads spoke of a widow who offered the finest meals anyone had ever tasted. Her table was always set. Her door was always open. And once you ate at her table, you never left hungry. In fact, you never left at all. This is the story of Margaret Holloway, the woman who fed strangers until the strangers stopped coming, and the town that pretended not to notice. The Holloway farm sat 3 miles outside of Ashford, tucked between the pine forests and the muddy curves of the Saline River. It wasn't much to look at. A weathered 2-story house with a crooked chimney, a barn that leaned to one side, and fields that had gone to seed after Thomas Holloway died in the spring of 1882. Thomas had been a quiet man, the kind who kept to himself and expected others to do the same. When he passed from what the doctor called a fever, most folks in Ashford nodded respectfully and moved on with their lives. His widow, Margaret, was left alone on that property with nothing but debt and a reputation for being odd. Margaret had always been different. She spoke to herself when she worked in the garden. She hung strange bundles of herbs above her doorways, and she had a way of looking at people that made them feel like she could see straight through to their bones. After Thomas died, she became even more withdrawn. She stopped coming to town except to buy flour and salt. She stopped attending church, and when people asked how she was managing, she just smiled and said she was getting by. Then the travelers started disappearing. It began in late autumn of 1882. A peddler named William Frost was making his way south through Arkansas when he stopped at the Holloway farm to ask for water. Margaret invited him inside. She insisted he stay for supper. According to what she told the sheriff weeks later, William ate his fill of venison stew and cornbread, thanked her kindly, and left before sunrise. William Frost never made it to his next stop. His wagon was found abandoned 2 miles down the road, his horse still hitched and grazing peacefully. His goods were untouched. His money was still in his coat pocket, but William himself was gone, as if he'd simply walked into the woods and vanished. The sheriff asked around. A few people remembered seeing the peddler head toward the Holloway place. When questioned, Margaret seemed confused and concerned. She described the meal she'd made. She mentioned that William had seemed tired but in good spirits. She offered to help search the woods. The sheriff thanked her and moved on. A month later, a drifter named Samuel Pike knocked on Margaret's door. He was looking for work and a hot meal. Margaret welcomed him in. She fed him chicken and dumplings with apple pie for dessert. Samuel told her it was the best food he'd eaten in years. He said he'd chop wood for her in the morning to repay her kindness. Samuel Pike was never seen again. His bedroll was found near the river, but there was no sign of struggle. No footprints leading away. Nothing to suggest where he'd gone or why he'd leave his few possessions behind. The pattern continued through the winter. A traveling preacher stopped at the farm and disappeared. 2 brothers heading west to seek their fortune had supper with the widow and vanished before dawn. A young woman running from an arranged marriage accepted Margaret's hospitality and was never heard from again. By the spring of 1883, 7 people had gone missing after visiting the Holloway farm. The town of Ashford began to whisper. Some said the widow must be cursed. Others suggested the land itself was haunted, that something in those woods was taking people. A few brave souls muttered that perhaps Margaret Holloway knew more than she was telling. But here's what made the situation truly strange. Every time someone disappeared, Margaret seemed genuinely surprised. She cooperated fully with the authorities. She provided detailed descriptions of her guests and their conversations. She even kept a ledger where she wrote down the names of everyone who stopped by, along with what she'd served them. The ledger was neat and organized, like a housewife's recipe book. There was nothing suspicious about it. Nothing except the fact that every single name in that book belonged to someone who'd vanished. The sheriff, a practical man named Coleman, didn't believe in curses or haunted land. He believed in evidence, and the evidence told him that 7 people had last been seen at the Holloway farm before disappearing without a trace. So in April of 1883, he decided to visit Margaret himself. He brought his deputy, a young man named Robert Hayes. They arrived at the farm in the early afternoon. Margaret greeted them warmly and invited them in for coffee. The house smelled incredible. Fresh bread was cooling on the counter. A pot of something savory simmered on the stove. The place was spotless and well kept. Nothing like you'd expect from a grieving widow living alone. Sheriff Coleman asked Margaret directly about the disappearances. She sat across from him at her kitchen table, her hands folded calmly in her lap, and told him the same thing she'd told him before. People came to her door hungry and tired. She fed them because it was the Christian thing to do. They left grateful and rested. What happened to them after they left her property, she couldn't say. The deputy noticed something odd while the sheriff questioned Margaret. There was a door in the kitchen that led down to the cellar, and from beneath that door came a smell that didn't quite match the pleasant aromas of bread and stew. It was earthier, heavier, like fresh-turned soil and something else he couldn't identify. When Deputy Hayes mentioned the cellar, Margaret's expression didn't change. She explained that she kept her preserves down there, vegetables from her garden, salted meats, the usual provisions any farm woman would store. The sheriff asked if he could see it. Margaret hesitated for just a moment, then smiled and said, "Of course." She lit a lamp and led them down the narrow wooden stairs. The cellar was larger than expected, stretching under most of the house. Shelves lined the walls, packed with jars of pickled vegetables, preserved fruits, and sealed containers. In the center of the room sat a large wooden table, scarred and stained from years of use, and along the far wall stood several large barrels. The sheriff asked what was in the barrels. Margaret said it was salt pork. She'd put up a whole hog after Thomas died, wanting to make sure she had enough meat to last the winter. The deputy noticed that the earthen floor looked recently disturbed in places, as if it had been dug up and smoothed over again. Sheriff Coleman was about to ask about the disturbed earth when Margaret did something unexpected. She insisted they stay for supper. It was getting late, she said, and the road back to town wasn't safe after dark. She'd make them the finest meal they'd ever tasted. It would be her pleasure to feed two hard-working men who kept the community safe. The sheriff politely declined. He and the deputy needed to get back to town. They had families waiting. But Margaret was insistent, almost desperate. She grabbed the sheriff's arm, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman her size. She told them she had venison marinating. She had fresh vegetables. She made the best gravy in 3 counties. It would be a shame for them to leave hungry. Something in her eyes made the sheriff uneasy. He pulled his arm free and firmly told Margaret they were leaving. She released him but didn't step back. She just stood there at the bottom of those cellar stairs, lamp in hand, watching them with an expression that was hard to read. Not angry, not sad, just empty. The sheriff and his deputy left the Holloway farm as the sun was setting. They didn't speak much on the ride back to town, but both men felt the same creeping sensation, like they'd narrowly avoided something terrible. That night, Sheriff Coleman couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about that cellar, about the disturbed earth, about the way Margaret had gripped his arm and insisted they stay for supper, about the fact that 7 people had disappeared after eating at her table, and he'd almost become the 8th. The next morning, he returned to the Holloway farm with 6 men. They had a warrant to search the property. When they arrived, they found the front door standing open. The house was empty. Margaret Holloway was gone. They searched anyway. In the kitchen, they found her ledger still sitting on the table. The last entry was from the previous day. It read, "Sheriff Coleman and Deputy Hayes declined supper." In the cellar, they found the barrels Margaret had claimed contained salt pork. When they opened the first barrel, they discovered she'd been telling the truth. It did contain meat, perfectly preserved, carefully prepared, but it wasn't pork. The sheriff ordered the earthen floor dug up. What they found underneath made 2 of the men vomit, and 1 faint outright. The disturbed patches of earth concealed a network of shallow graves, but the graves didn't contain complete bodies. They contained parts, bones that had been carefully stripped of meat, remains that had been efficiently processed, like a butcher might process a cow or a pig. They found 7 sets of remains. Each one matched a missing person. the traveling preacher, the drifter, the peddler, the brothers, the young woman. All of them buried beneath Margaret Holloway's cellar floor, reduced to bones and scraps. The men searched the rest of the property. In the barn, they found tools that had been meticulously cleaned. In the smokehouse, they found hooks and chains. And in Margaret's bedroom, they found a journal. The journal explained everything. Margaret Holloway had been feeding people long before the travelers started disappearing. She'd fed them with meat from her livestock, with vegetables from her garden, with love and care, and the skills her mother had taught her. But after Thomas died, the money ran out. The livestock had to be sold to pay debts. The garden couldn't provide enough. And Margaret, who found her only purpose in feeding others, couldn't bear to stop. So she'd found another source of meat. The journal entries were matter-of-fact, clinical. She wrote about the travelers who came to her door the way another woman might write about shopping for groceries. She described the best way to prepare each cut. She noted which seasonings worked best with which dishes. She recorded every meal she'd served, every compliment she'd received, every satisfied smile from a guest who'd enjoyed her cooking. Margaret Holloway had killed 7 people, butchered them in her cellar, and served them to subsequent guests. Each traveler who sat at her table had unknowingly consumed the person who'd sat there before them. And Margaret had done it all with the pride of a woman who simply wanted to feed people well. The most disturbing part of the journal was the final entry, written the morning before the sheriff's visit. Margaret had written that she was running low on provisions. She needed new guests. She hoped someone would stop by soon. She had a new recipe she wanted to try. A manhunt began immediately. Posses searched the woods and countryside. Neighboring towns were alerted. Wanted posters went up throughout Arkansas and the surrounding states. But Margaret Holloway was never found. Some say she died in the wilderness, unable to survive without her farm and her kitchen. Others claim she made it to another state and started over somewhere else, perhaps with a new name and a new home, still inviting travelers in for supper. The most unsettling theory came from an old woman in Ashford who'd known Margaret since childhood. She said Margaret had always been strange, even as a girl. She'd loved cooking more than anything else in the world. It was the only thing that made her happy, the only thing that gave her life meaning. And maybe, the old woman suggested, Margaret hadn't really understood that what she was doing was wrong. Maybe in her twisted mind, she was still just doing what she'd always done, taking care of people, making sure no one left her table hungry. The Holloway farm was burned to the ground 3 weeks after the discovery. The townspeople wanted no trace of it left standing. They scattered the ashes and plowed the earth. They tried to forget the horror that had happened there. But the story didn't end with the fire. Over the following months, strange reports started coming in from across the region. Travelers spoke of a woman who offered meals to strangers on lonely roads. She appeared at dusk, they said, always near wooded areas, always alone. She'd approach with a kind smile and an invitation to supper. Her table was always set. Her door was always open. Most people who encountered her declined the invitation and moved on, but a few accepted, and those few were never seen again. A farmer in Missouri claimed he'd been walking home late one night when he saw a woman cooking over a fire in the woods. She'd called out to him, offered him stew. He'd been about to accept when he noticed something in the pot, something that looked like fingers. He'd run without looking back. A merchant in Tennessee reported a similar encounter. A woman had flagged him down on a deserted road, asking if he was hungry. When he'd looked at her closely, he'd recognized her from a wanted poster. He'd whipped his horse and fled, and the woman had simply stood in the road behind him, watching him go with that same empty expression the sheriff had described. The sightings continued for years. Some people believed they were seeing Margaret Holloway's ghost. Others thought she was still alive, still moving from place to place, still feeding strangers. The reports eventually slowed and then stopped altogether around 1890. But there's a detail about this case that most people don't know, a detail that the authorities kept quiet because they didn't know how to explain it. When they'd examined those barrels in Margaret's cellar more carefully, they'd found something impossible. The meat had been preserved with techniques that shouldn't have worked. The flesh had been kept fresh far longer than any known method of preservation could achieve. And when the local doctor examined the remains found buried in the cellar, he discovered something that troubled him deeply. The bones showed signs of having been consumed, not by animals, by humans. But the marks on the bones suggested they'd been gnawed on while the person was still alive. The doctor never officially reported this finding. He buried it in his notes and tried to forget about it. But he confided in one person before he died, his daughter, and she wrote it down in her own diary, which was discovered decades later in an attic in Little Rock. According to the doctor's account, Margaret Holloway hadn't simply killed travelers and cooked them. She'd kept them alive in that cellar. She'd kept them there in the dark, feeding them, caring for them, fattening them up like livestock. And when they were ready, she'd taken what she needed, piece by piece, keeping them alive as long as possible to ensure the meat stayed fresh. The remaining question that no one could answer was this: if Margaret had been keeping people alive in that cellar, taking meat from them gradually, then where had those people gone when the sheriff searched the property? The graves contained 7 sets of remains, but the journal mentioned more than 7 guests. Nearly a dozen names were listed in that ledger, which meant that when Margaret disappeared, she hadn't gone alone. She'd taken some of them with her. The Arkansas widow was never caught. The case was never officially closed. And to this day, there are people in the deep woods and back roads of the South who claim to have encountered a woman who offers meals to tired travelers. They say she's kind and soft-spoken. They say her food smells better than anything you can imagine. They say once you sit at her table, you never want to leave. And they're right about that last part. Because according to the stories, once you accept Margaret Holloway's hospitality, once you taste what she's prepared, you don't leave. You become part of her pantry, part of her preserves, part of the meal she'll serve to the next hungry stranger who knocks on her door. The people of Ashford don't talk about Margaret Holloway anymore. The younger generations don't even know the story. The farm where she lived is just an empty field now, overgrown with weeds and forgotten. But sometimes, on cold winter nights, people driving past that field claim they can smell something cooking: meat and herbs and fresh-baked bread. The smell drifts across the road and makes your mouth water, makes you hungry, makes you wish you could stop for a hot meal. But everyone who lives in that part of Arkansas knows better than to follow that smell. Because in those woods, in that darkness, Margaret Holloway might still be setting her table. She might still be waiting for guests, and she might still be perfecting her recipes. 3 weeks after the Holloway farm burned, a young couple traveling through Arkansas stopped at a small cabin they'd never seen before. An older woman answered the door. She said her name was Mary. She invited them in for supper. The husband almost declined, but his wife was heavily pregnant and exhausted from travel. The smell coming from inside the cabin was incredible, so they accepted. The woman served them the finest meal they'd ever tasted: tender meat that melted in their mouths, vegetables seasoned to perfection, gravy so rich they sopped up every drop with fresh bread. As they ate, the woman watched them with a small, satisfied smile. When they finished, she asked if they'd like to stay the night. The roads weren't safe after dark, she said. They could leave in the morning. The husband agreed. His wife was too tired to protest. They were shown to a small bedroom upstairs. As they climbed the stairs, the husband noticed something odd. There was a door in the kitchen floor, a door that led down, and from beneath that door came a smell like fresh-turned earth. But he was tired, and the bed was comfortable, and his wife was already asleep. So he lay down beside her and closed his eyes. In the morning, the woman who'd called herself Mary brought them breakfast in bed. More incredible food. She insisted they eat every bite. She said they needed their strength for the journey ahead. She said they'd need to keep their energy up. She said this while standing in the doorway, blocking their exit, with that same empty smile that Sheriff Coleman had seen years before in a cellar that should have been full of salt pork, but contained something else entirely.